this talk is about how wars are entangled with particular regimes of sensory apprehension. So war is a crucible of sensory experience, and the historian Joanna Bork argues that from the moment war is declared, the sensual worlds of all its protagonists are marshalled to the cause. And I agree, but moreover, I'm going to argue here that it's not just that pre-existing sensory capacities get marshalled to the war effort, but ways of sensing are fundamentally reattuned, transformed, and made anew during war. So I use the term sensate regimes of war to refer to the transformation and fabrication of ways of sensing in the preparation, prosecution, and aftermaths of war. Now, there's lots of scholarship exploring the co-production of vision and violence in wartime that argues ultimately that to see is to kill. So, for example, Paul Virilio explores the convergence of perception and destruction, the deadly harmony that always establishes itself between the functions of eye and weapon. And more recently, Antoine Bousquet, in The Eye of War, explores the development of what he calls the martial gaze, where ultimately visibility equals death. So lots on vision and violence, but work on the other senses and war is still largely noticeable by its absence. And in part, I think this is because of the kind of visual turn or the kind of dominance of the visual term in scholarship, which is great, but it has its blind spots and it has difficulty speaking of the other senses in particular. As such, my research and this paper tries to trace some of the kind of multiple imbrications of another crucial sensory way of knowing, that of smell, with war. So I'm going to argue that people and communities and militaries develop a nose for war, for hints of wartime threat and enmity in particular. So this is what's coming up in the talk. First, I'm going to briefly explore what smell is and some of the reasons why the topic of smell and war remain underanalyzed and under-theorized. I'm then going to trace a particular genealogy of smell and war through 4 empirical case studies, looking at soldiers' practices of smell awareness and discipline, looking at the enrolment of non-human animal olfaction into wartime practices, looking at the mobilization of indigenous trackers into war, and then finally, in the empirical section, looking at wartime experiments in kind of smell prosthetics and machine olfaction. And then drawing upon that genealogy, I'm going to conclude with a slightly more theoretical discussion of the overall fabrication of sensate regimes of war and the importance of what I call the trace of enmity for warfighting. Okay, so that's the plan for the talk. So the sense of smell or olfaction, it's sometimes referred to, provides continuous information about the chemical composition of the surrounding atmosphere. It's ongoing all the time, it's autonomic, we smell all the time, we can't switch it off. And what it enables is the apprehension of presences which are not fully realized yet, which are emerging, or presences which have departed, which are kind of lingering as a trace. So smell is kind of attuned to whether things are coming or going spatially and temporally. It continuously mediates between presence and absence, the proximate and the distant, the interior and the exterior. So as Elaine Scarry notes in The Body in Pain, smell is a sensory mode that has emerged to watch over the entry of the world into the body. However, despite this, smell is often thought to occupy quite a kind of lowly position in the hierarchy of the senses in modern Western culture and epistemology, in a modernity that has normally been considered resolutely ocularcentric, according to Jonathan Crary. So sight is rational and geometric, but smells, by contrast, often seem to escape kind of straightforward temporal or spatial determination or analysis. They emanate from objects, they emanate from subjects, but they drift and they waft and they linger in space and time. They avoid fixation, they avoid localization. So smell is sometimes considered the least informative, the least intellectual of the senses, because it's attuned to the insubstantial, to the formless. And further, due to its marginal and repressed status in contemporary Western culture, smell is hardly ever considered as a political vehicle. Constance Classen and colleagues argue. However, smell is crucial in evolutionary terms to survival, to the apprehension of danger, and particular smells can evoke such vivid whole body sensations, such emotionally charged memories, that we shouldn't dismiss its political significance so quickly. Moreover, war is a crucible of often radical phenomenological and sensory experience for many of its participants, transforming everyday sensory hermeneutics, transforming the hierarchy of the senses and associated ways of knowing and rules of living in the world. So many accounts of war note how sensory hermeneutics beyond the visual, so for example, the skilled acoustomology of the direction of incoming fire, or the sense of touch in the trenches, have been crucial to survival, in particular milieus of conflict. So in the following sections, I'm going to explore further how smell figures in various wartime practices, and I'll focus initially on the way that soldiers have attuned to the olfactory. Okay, so militaries have long been attentive to both the nature of their own smells and to the olfactory traces of others, particularly when undertaking patrol or reconnaissance or stealth combat missions. So, for example, in John Hockey's ethnography of UK infantry training squaddies, he highlights how recruits are trained to sense the potential presence of the enemy right across the sensorium, including via specific attunement to smells. Fags, cook grubs, smellies, piss, shit, and the like are all dead giveaways, particularly if the ground is closed or say it's hot. You have to be like a bit of an animal out there. You have to be alert for his traces. At the same time, Hockey notes how infantry must learn to minimize their own olfactory traces, being attentive to the direction of the wind, engaging in smell camouflage to cover their own tracks. Memoirs and oral histories of the Vietnam War similarly detail the lengths that US long-range patrols would go to in order to avoid olfactory detection. These included not bathing prior to missions, not wearing newly laundered clothes, not smoking, not using odorous heat tabs to cook with, mixing rations with cold water only, burying all waste and litter, foregoing the use of any soaps, deodorants, or mosquito repellents. Soldiers on deep reconnaissance would even take antidiarrheals to reduce bowel movements, as their fecal matter, in the words of one soldier, smelled differently from the enemy's and was a calling card announcing GIs had been in the area. They would even fundamentally change their diets in order to try and alter the smell of their fecal matter and their own sweat. We used to eat their food. This is American soldiers in Vietnam. We used to eat their food. I'd find caches of rice. I used to live off small birds and snakes. If you're out there a period of time, you develop an odor which is undetectable. You could smell Americans because of the garbage we ate, especially sea rations, the kind of canned foods. Smoking was not even up for discussion. The Viet Cong didn't wear insect repellent and neither did we. The enemy could smell it on you and locate your position. Cooking was out of the question. Rations were eaten cold. After 6 days in the jungle, the combination of stale sweat and plain old body odor made us all stink. But the smell could actually be an advantage. Your diet gave you a distinct aroma. Viet Cong smelled like rotten fish. We had been eating Vietnamese rations for the past 2 weeks just to pick up their smell. If any trail watchers got downwind from our team, they think we were another VC unit. Now, apart from the kind of the practices of smell discipline that are detailed in that account by Chambers there, one further point worth drawing your attention to is that there's this kind of notable olfactory othering going on in this kind of essentialized, racialized and animalized language. The Viet Cong smelled like rotten fish. And in fact, partly due to the fact that smells do literally transgress, do literally blur bodily boundaries, you often see smell talk entangled with these sort of reassertions of boundaries and identities, whereby differences in odour become articulated in terms of much wider moral distinctions and social hierarchies and fears of contamination. So smell is always more than just a way of sensing the world. Its interpretation is a way of making sense of the world. And clearly here, it's an idiom for the reproduction of well-worn ideas of race and of enemies as dehumanized others. But race here is not just epidermalized. It's not just something that is visual, that is written on the skin. It's understood as an olfactory reality, as something that can be sensed even when there's no visual presence of the body. Okay, so my second case study, moving beyond soldiers' own practices of smell discipline and camouflage, is to look at how militaries have also attempted to kind of mobilize numerous other olfactory capacities and sensibilities in wartime. And in particular, many non-human animals possess far superior olfactory abilities than humans do. They're capable of detecting scents many miles away. As such, non-human animals, particularly dogs, not just dogs, but mostly dogs, have been extensively mobilized in wartime to detect a range of odorants and in a variety of conflict-related practices. So these include kind of sweeping searches for weapons caches, for explosives, include the detection of mines, the detection of tunnels. They include accompanying soldiers on patrol duties, and they include tracking the enemy across terrain. So, for example, in the Vietnam War, again, it's estimated that over 4,000 dogs were deployed by US forces, predominantly German Shepherds, performing sentry and patrol duties in what were called scout dog platoons. So scout dog platoons would be assigned to companies who were encountering significant trouble from insurgent attacks or from ambushes when they're out on patrol. Dogs could detect olfactory realities at levels that were completely imperceptible to humans. So the thinking was that they would be able to sense the potential presence of danger much further ahead. Now, the kind of legibility of and the utility of these perceptions was fundamentally predicated upon the development of really intimate one-to-one relationships between war dogs and their handlers. So the dogs have these really acute olfactory instincts, but in order to benefit from it, the handler has to learn to read, has to learn to trust their companion animals' kind of individual personality, demeanor, and reactions on patrol. And of course, the dogs are taught not to bark because that would alert the enemy. So the handler has to watch really closely for what the dog is doing, for the expression of what are called silent alerts that are unique to the dog, that are idiosyncratic, and that indicate that they have detected this kind of unfamiliar airborne scent. So this is a dog handler. Many dogs did not have an easily recognizable pattern of behavior that signified detection of danger. It was up to the handler to interpret his dog's behavior. This ability was one that was first developed in school. It was further refined by training and experience. Because the signal of alert varied, the importance of knowing how to interpret a dog's action cannot be overstated. It required vigilance on the part of the handler in noting every nuance of his dog's behavior. If the dog alerted and the handler did not see or recognize the signal, it could be fatal for the dog team and the other members of the unit who were following. So the kind of sensate regime here is like thoroughly, it's quite idiosyncratic, it's thoroughly co-constituted. It's this learnt process of interaction and awareness and sensory translation across species. This is another dog handler, John Burnham, in Vietnam, who describes his relationship with his working dog Timber in his book, A Soldier's Best Friend, as follows. I learned that my scout dog is the real point man, not me. The point man is the person at the front of a patrol. It will be my job to translate his dog language into English so I could convey to everyone else what the dog sense, but he was the one in charge. And in Bauman's memoirs of his experiences on the ground, they're punctuated by all these kind of slippages and reversals of human-animal boundaries and hierarchies. He's the one in charge all the time, he's saying. So the human lives of those on patrol became fundamentally dependent upon their dogs' more than human capacities to sense danger, challenging these kind of conventional war narratives of human exceptionalism and autonomy. And moreover, you get these quite intense emotional bonds of love and care developing between dogs and their handlers in conflict scenarios. A web of interspecies dependencies in Haraway's terms. Having said that, it's important to note that these intimacies, these reversals of hierarchies that developed in wartime were underwritten by wider structural and instrumental relations of domination. So all the dogs were ultimately classified by the US Department of Defense as equipment. And in spite of the kind of impassioned pleas of their handlers, all but a handful were abandoned to unknown fates at the end of the Vietnam War. This kind of deployment of dogs was, I guess, kind of defensive. It's to alert to danger when patrolling. In addition to that kind of more defensive use of dog teams, there were a number of elite offensive combat tracker teams established by the US in Vietnam, drawing on a model previously used by the British colonial forces in Kenya and in Malaya. And these small units included a dog handler with a Labrador retriever typically, and they were dispatched to areas where firefights had just taken place to try and follow the tracks of the enemy as they retreated. So they were manhunting teams, in other words. Following on that theme, I'm going to go to my third case study, which is about tracking and pursuit activity, which came to play an increasingly important role in many other counterinsurgency campaigns in the wars of decolonization in the second half of the 20th century, where the fundamental grammar of the fighting in these wars similarly involved insurgents operating across, retreating into kind of wide bush and jungle terrain. And in particular, conflicts in Africa, such as the wars in Angola, Rhodesia, and Southwest Africa, as they were called, Zimbabwe and Namibia now, from the 1960s to the 1980s, were, according to Stapleton, dominated by tracking and anti-tracking. And I'm going to turn to those conflicts now. So tracking is more than just fixed situational awareness, being aware of your surroundings. It's the active pursuit of a kind of mutable trail. It's the kind of imbrication of multi-sensory knowing with movement. So Stapleton describes it as follows. Tracking is the ability to pursue and close with an animal or human by following signs, commonly called spoor, an Afrikaans word, left behind in the environment. These include footprints, disturbed vegetation, evidence of feeding, biological waste, sounds, and smell. Experienced trackers use the appearance of these signs to determine the direction of their subject's movement and the approximate age of the spoor to indicate how far ahead in time and space the subject is. So accomplished tracking required this kind of thorough familiarity with the landscape, with the climate, with the ecology of the local region in order to be able to successfully follow spoor and anticipate enemy movements. And while some of these skills could be taught, counterinsurgency warfare became crucially dependent upon those who were well practiced in these skills being recruited, being deployed as wartime trackers. And as such, state forces specifically recruited members of indigenous communities that were renowned for their bush knowledge and their highly nuanced skills in tracking and hunting. So, for example, the South African Defence Force enlisted large numbers of semi-nomadic San people as spoorsner, as trackers in the war in Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia. And these San trackers were formed into specialised so-called Bushman battalions and enrolled into special forces teams and established this quite powerful martial reputation. And smells and atmospheric fluctuations were significant dimensions of their tracking activity. So in an analysis of San wartime tracking, Gibson notes that when trackers are on a spoor or on patrol, they continuously move into and are surrounded by an olfactory landscape. It includes their own and others' odour, as well as traces from the body of an insurgent, the aroma of certain plant sap that is exuded when broken, the movement of birds, animals and insects attracted or alarmed by the smell of a person in the landscape. And further, this landscape is often experienced by the tracker as, at a very kind of intuitive level, as expressed in the following account of wartime tracking by Bo, a San Spoorsner. Bo says, "We know our own smell, but sometimes these people have been walking for days, carrying heavy loads in the heat. They have a specific smell of sweat that is different from ours or from the white soldiers. They do not often make fire, but sometimes they kill something. If it is fresh, you get that coppery smell or smell broken intestines. As the air, the wind moves, you can pick up traces. It's quite strong before the rain. Be very, very careful then. Something is not right. You just feel it." So tracking involves these kind of multiple sensory modalities and ontologies, the tracing of these kind of non-linear threads of scent rather than direct lines of sight. And when sensed through this kind of regime, the body of the enemy is not simply contiguous with the porous boundaries of the skin. It exceeds, it exists beyond its visible surfaces, it includes these kind of odorous emanations and other smells that are generated as a result of its movements, producing this kind of trail of spoor that a skilled tracker can actively pursue. So the advanced skills, the advanced sensibilities of indigenous spoorsner were crucial components of wartime tracking, and attunement to the olfactory was a critical source of knowledge when hunting down the enemy. Okay, the final empirical section, I'm going to return to the Vietnam War, which was a laboratory for numerous kind of techno-scientific experiments in smelling, in tracing the enemy. So, for example, in 1966, US patrols from the 1st Air Cavalry Division were sent out with the point man carrying this device, this kind of backpack device, the General Electric's Olfatronics XM2, colloquially known as the people sniffer. And essentially it's this kind of portable laboratory. It funnels wind through the intake just below the barrel into a kind of chemical assay kit contained in the backpack. And the idea was to try and sense on the fly changes in atmospheric ammonia levels, which were indicative of effluents such as human sweat or urine, and hence supposedly of the potential presence of the enemy. The experiment was pretty short-lived on the ground, mostly because fluctuations in air currents at ground level meant that the device often registered the sweat of the wearer rather than of Viet Cong troops. As such, a further version of the people sniffer was developed into a helicopter-mounted configuration, the XM3 airborne personnel detector, attuned to ammonia and attuned to carbon molecules produced by cooking fires that could be detected in rising air currents. So the XM3 became pretty standard equipment. It was deployed in Operation Snoopy, where helicopters flew at treetop level over a broad area in this kind of sweeping suspicion mode. Whenever any chemical signs of life were detected, cluster bombs were dropped in order to try and flush out anyone below so that they could be attacked. However, the detectors had difficulty distinguishing between occupied and recently abandoned areas because the target particulates would kind of hang about in the air for many hours. So that was quickly exploited by North Vietnamese forces, who responded to Snoopy missions by lighting kind of smouldering fires all around the patrolled environment to generate false positives. So one operator reported, it's sort of like a scout dog. You've got to know your machine, know it can make mistakes. All our machines have personalities. The overall effectiveness of the XM3 was pretty ambiguous. It certainly generated lots of positive media coverage back home in, Popular Mechanics and these sort of magazines that American technoscience was winning the war. In reality, it probably did very little. A further experiment in machine olfaction occurred in an attempt to stop the flow of enemy combatants and resources from north to south along a key jungle supply route, the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighbouring Laos. The particular paths used changed constantly. The area was very broad. It was too inhospitable for ground troops to monitor. You couldn't monitor it from the air because of the jungle canopy. Lots of the movement occurred at night. So the proposed solution was to seed the entire area through which troops might be moving with 20,000 electronic sensors thrown from the air. And these sensors were kind of cutting-edge electronics disguised as vegetation. Crucially, they were all attuned to the non-visual. So again, you have chemoreceptors attuned to ammonia, attuned to carbon, as well as sensors attuned to seismic vibration in the earth and to acoustic changes in ambient noise, all of which might be associated with the movement of troops. Signals from the sensors were relayed on by transmission planes to a control room from where airstrikes were called in if the pattern of signals was interpreted as enemy movements rather than the movements of civilians or water buffalo. This was a phenomenally expensive operation. It cost $1 billion a year during its period of operation. It went on for about 5 years of the Vietnam War, 67 to 72. However, North Vietnamese soldiers, again, quickly learned to spot and to spoof the sensors. So they would hang buckets of urine in the trees to generate these kind of simulacra of enmity in the sensory system. By most accounts, the program manifestly failed in its own terms to disrupt traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail by the time it was shut down. Nonetheless, I think it's important because here we see the kind of experimental beginnings of this more distributed, this more autonomous regime of machine sensation being laid down. And crucially, it is a sensate regime that, again, tries to track enemy presence even when visual recognition is impossible. So it tries to machinically sense olfactory traces across this diffuse area. And the important thing is again, that smell, the apprehension of smell depends on these fluctuating levels of chemical intensity. So it's not binary visual presence that you're there or you're not. Okay, it indexes the strength of this approaching or lingering trace of absent presence. So it indexes coming and going. That's kind of what's crucial here. Okay, those are my case studies. I'm just going to do 10 minutes or so trying to, provide some more theoretical context to those various studies. And I think the first point I want to make is simply that despite those kind of experiments in machinic sensation that I've just described, despite all the major developments in advanced technologies of targeting and remote warfare that have happened in recent decades, wars, particularly wars of occupation, are still fundamentally embodied. And as Ken McLeish notes, the body's unruly matter is war's most necessary and necessarily expendable raw material. He's talking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which could not carry on without the physical presence of tens of thousands of such bodies. And so wars are inevitably experienced through all the kind of sensory modalities with which bodies encounter worlds. Soldiering on the ground involves multiple situated, embodied ways of knowing, ways of navigating the battle space. And in this kind of intense practico-sensory realm, sensory hermeneutics beyond the visual have often been crucial to survival and to the kind of offensive prosecution of military violence. So I've tried to argue here that if we're looking at smell, this has variously involved soldiers' own somatic work. It's involved the mobilization, indeed the breeding of dogs for their more than human sensory capacities. It's involved the conscription of the embodied skills, the habitus of indigenous spursna. And it's involved the development of these kind of improvised experiments in machinic sensation. Now, all this activity, I think, is typically quite ad hoc and makeshift. It's very grounded in a particular situation. It's discontinuous. It's not a clear linear development. It's tethered to these kind of local pragmatics in these laboratories of specific wartime environments, these generative laboratories. So I don't think we can really understand it as the fully rationalized organization of a perceptual field. It's not informed by universal laws, by universal abstractions. Rather, it resembles the work of what Deleuze and Guattari call minor science. Minor science is more concerned with following the flow of matter. And crucially, I argue that it is tied to a particular ontology, not an ontology of visual presence, but the ontology of the trace. And the trace, according to Derrida, has a complex and unstable relationship to presence. It is the mark of the absence of a presence. And as I kind of discussed in the final example, the odorous trace, the chemical trace in particular, indicates this kind of emerging or lingering absent presence in ways that are more fine-grained and in some senses are fundamentally orthogonal to vision. So in the absence of a visible enemy, if you're unsure where to look, what militaries have done, what martial power has done, for a long time has explored other ways of sensing across space and time to try and identify signatures of threat. You can't see presence, but can you identify the trace, the direction of enmity? And I think it's for that reason that attunement to the trace via senses such as smell in particular has long been quite important in war. It's been central to wartime practices such as tracking, such as hunting, such as sweeping search, looking for arms or explosives. And I've tried to argue that this occurs through cultivating soldiers' smell practices, through animal olfaction, through indigenous recruitment, and through machinic olfaction. And in recent wars, it has once again been animal olfaction, the use of sniffer dogs in particular, that has been on the front line, whether that's been to try and track insurgent bodies or to sense traces of enmity on patrol or to track down arms caches or improvised explosive devices, which are buried, which are invisible. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the US developed this major $23 billion program that was tasked with detecting improvised explosive devices, which had become the main source of threat to US forces. And there were years of money and manpower and resources and drones and algorithms thrown at the problem. But at the end of it, the head of this program, General Michael Oates, admitted in 2010 that dogs are the best detectors, and there were 3,000 dogs used in Afghanistan. And I think the reason for this is because despite these kind of experiments in machinic olfaction that I mentioned previously, there has yet to be a really fully scientific understanding of the way that smell works. So, as Bousquet notes, the development of vision, which is perhaps the most preeminent martial sense, crucially depended upon the development of a science of visual phenomena, upon the rational organization of the perceptual field in a way that could reduce sensorial activities to logical rules and procedures amenable to mechanization and automation. However, there is not a comparable science of smell, nor even theoretical consensus as to whether it is the shape or the vibrations of chemical molecules that receptor neurons respond to. So Reinhardt notes that even the biological and chemical nature of this denigrated sense remain to be worked out entirely. And the movements of chemical molecules through kind of unruly atmospheres, winds and temperatures, how they disperse, how they linger, are not well understood. So if you don't have these fundamental properties and principles upon which mechanization and automation might proceed, if they're not clear, then trained animals still vastly outperform the capacities of machines to trace smells at minute concentrations over large distances. Now, that's not to say that the goal of more scientific comprehension and rationalized machinic simulation of smell is not being actively sought, is not being extensively funded. So over the last decade, US Defense Research, DARPA, has commissioned various projects to try and understand, to try and imitate, to try and exploit the capacities of non-human animals and insects to engage in highly discriminating scent-related search behavior. So these include the Real Nose project, which simulates canine olfaction, and the Stealthy Insect Sensor project. And this latter project involves the training, the selection, and the breeding of honeybee colonies to try and better understand, to try and modify, to try and exploit the scenting capacities of the swarm, which is itself a form of chemical pheromone-based collective behavior. So Kozak argues that the bee is being remade as a military technology and a strategic resource for the battlefield. Humans are making bees into sensory prostheses that embody military interests. And I think these are the potential kind of hunters and beaters and pack animals of the future militarized hunt. Okay, my final slide, just some concluding thoughts. Just have a quick sip. So just to conclude, I've argued that the particular affordances of smell, its kind of mediation between absence and presence, enables the apprehension of threat and enmity in ways that are fundamentally orthogonal to senses such as vision. And as such, you get the construction of these, myriad kind of sensate regimes, olfactory regimes of war, which are crafted in various local conditions with numerous aims, tracking the insurgent body, locating visually invisible, improvised explosive devices, performing sweeping searches, hunter killing, manhunting, and so on. And these developments, I think, supplement ocularcentric accounts of martial sensation that principally theorize how rationalized and scientific and abstract ways of seeing and associated ontologies of visual presence have become coterminous with violence in the doing of war. I mean, that's part of the case, but I think there's more going on. This work kind of challenges that narrative by pointing also to the importance of an alternative ontology, which is the signature, which is the trace of enmity, which indexes degrees of absent presence. And on many occasions in wartime, the capacity of vision to apprehend, to navigate the world is limited. And in such cases, it's the capacity to smell that has enabled militaries to kill. So I suggest that critical inquiry into war would be productively enhanced through a wider analytic orientation, away from just scopic regimes towards this kind of conceptual lens of sensate regimes of war that moves beyond the predominant focus on the gaze and on the ocular that has become particularly established through the visual turn in scholarship, and that tries to think about the ways that war is conducted through and on all the senses, right across a sensorium that is itself thoroughly transformed through war. If nothing else, I hope to have demonstrated here how an analytic engagement with smell and war is far from an esoteric concern, but ultimately an issue of life and death. Okay, thank you very much for listening.